I was living in a nursing home, a place where life shrinks to the size of a single room, when my wealthy sister left me a ranch with a hidden fortune in Yellowstone. The news was a shock, a window thrown open in a dusty, sealed-off life. But then my daughter Vanessa, the one who had abandoned me here years ago, appeared at my door. She came with her lawyer, her eyes gleaming with a cold, pragmatic greed as she shoved a stack of legal papers at me. "Transfer it to us," she'd said, her voice devoid of any emotion but impatience. "You're in a home. You have no use for it. You're gonna die anyway." She was so sure of her victory, so confident in my weakness. Then the door to my small room opened and my lawyer, my sister's lawyer, a man who held the full weight of a multi-million-dollar estate behind him, walked into the room. "Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Beatrice Monroe. For 40 years I was a professor of geology. I taught my students to see the stories hidden in stone, to understand the immense, slow power of time and pressure. This is the story of how I used that knowledge to reclaim my own life from a daughter who saw me as nothing more than a fossil." The room was a nondescript box, a study in the sterile, silent art of dying. The walls were a pale, non-committal shade of eggshell. The floor was a durable, easy-to-clean linoleum. The single window looked out onto a small, meticulously manicured patch of lawn, a square of green that was as contained and as lifeless as the room itself. This was my world now. A bed, a chair, a small table, and a television that was always on, its cheerful, mindless chatter a constant and mostly failing defense against the crushing weight of the silence. My daughter, Vanessa, sat in the visitor's chair, a slash of vibrant, expensive color in my muted, monochrome world. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire monthly budget for this place. Her handbag, a brand I recognized from the glossy magazines I sometimes read, sat on the floor beside her like a well-trained, exotic pet. Beside her sat her lawyer, a young man named Davies with a slick, confident smile and the hungry, predatory eyes of a shark that has just scented particularly weak and wounded fish. They had arrived 10 minutes ago, an invading army of two, their presence filling my compact room with an alien energy of ambition and greed. And now they were laying out the terms of my surrender. "It's a simple transfer of title, Mother," Vanessa said, her voice a carefully modulated symphony of reasonableness and condescension. She pushed a thick sheaf of legal documents across my small bedside table, the papers sliding to a stop next to a half-empty glass of water and my daily allotment of pills. "It's the most logical, most practical solution for everyone." He was talking about the ranch. My sister Josephine's ranch. The sprawling, wild, and beautiful piece of Yellowstone she had left me in her will just a week ago. A gift that had been a shocking, life-altering bolt of lightning in the quiet, gray sky of my life. "You're in a facility," Vanessa continued, her tone that of a patient adult explaining a simple, obvious truth to a difficult child. "You can't manage a property of that size. The taxes, the upkeep, the liability, it's a tremendous responsibility. A significant liability, really. Derek and I are prepared to take that weight off your hands. We will manage it for you. We will ensure that it is properly taken care of." Her lawyer, Davies, chimed in, his voice a smooth, reassuring purr that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's a very generous offer, Mrs. Monroe. Your daughter is simply trying to protect you, to simplify your life. This document just gives her the power of attorney to manage the asset on your behalf. It's the smart thing to do." I stared at them, my mind a slow, foggy, and exhausted thing. The grief for my sister was still a raw, open wound. The shock of the inheritance had not yet settled. And now this assault, this quiet, legalistic, and unbelievably cruel invasion. "I need some time to think," I whispered, my voice a rusty and used thing. Vanessa let out a long, impatient sigh, a sound I knew so well, the very tone that had become the soundtrack to the last decade of our relationship. It was the expression of her profound and constant annoyance with my very existence. "Mother, there is nothing to think about," she said, her voice losing its patient, reasonable quality and taking on a sharp, brittle edge. "Let's be realistic here. You are 75 years old. You are in a nursing home. Your health is delicate. You are not going to be riding horses and wrangling cattle in Yellowstone. This is a piece of paper that represents a resource you cannot use. A piece of property that, frankly, will be ours in a few years anyway. And then came the final brutal and unforgivably honest blow. She leaned forward, her eyes so like my own in shape but so utterly devoid of any warmth, any empathy, any love, locking onto mine. "Transfer it to us," she said, her voice a flat, pragmatic and soulless command. "It's the logical thing to do. You're gonna die anyway." The words, the casual, dismissive and breathtakingly cruel finality of them, hung in the air, a poison that was both tasteless and instantly lethal. She was not just talking about a piece of property. She was talking about my life. My very existence, which she had just reduced to a minor and soon-to-be-resolved logistical inconvenience. I was a dying woman, a temporary placeholder, a stubborn, sentimental obstacle standing in the way of her inheritance. I looked at her, my daughter, the child I had raised, the woman I had loved, and I saw a stranger. A cold, hard, and thoroughly ugly stranger. And in that moment, a feeling inside me, a part of myself that had been dormant for years, something I thought had died in the beige loneliness of this room, began to stir. A spark of the old me began to glow, the woman I had been before I was a widow, before I was a patient, before I was a burden. The flame of the professor, the scientist, the woman who did not accept the surface of things, but who always dug deeper, was rekindled. And as I stared into the cold, hard, and astonishingly foolish eyes of my own daughter, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a lesson. An education in geology, in value, and in the immense, slow, and catastrophic power of time and pressure. She thought she was closing a deal. She had no idea she had just declared a war. The memory of my sister's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, was a stark and comforting contrast to the scene that was currently unfolding in my sterile room. He had come to see me a week ago, a tall, kind-faced man with a quiet, respectful demeanor and eyes that held a genuine, compassionate sorrow. He had been Josephine's lawyer for over 30 years, and he was not just an executor of her will. He was the steward of her legacy, the loyal agent of her final, magnificent wishes. He had sat in the same uncomfortable visitor's chair that was now occupied by my daughter's slick shark of a lawyer, but his presence had been a comfort, not a threat. He had broken the news of Josephine's death to me gently, his voice a low, sad rumble. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep at her beloved ranch after a long and fiercely fought struggle with cancer, a private war she had, in her typical stubborn and private way, told no one about. The grief had been a sudden, violent ambush. Josephine and I had been opposites in almost every way. She was the adventurer, the risk-taker, the woman who had left our quiet academic family behind to build a real estate empire in the wild, untamed landscapes of Wyoming and Montana. I was the scholar, the bookish one who had found my own adventures in the pages of geological surveys and the silent, ancient stories of the earth. But we had been bound by a profound, unshakable sisterly love, a bond that had transcended distance and our different paths in life. After he had given me a moment to absorb the news of her passing, Marcus had opened his heavy leather briefcase and had pulled out a copy of her will. "Josephine was a unique and a very specific woman, Beatrice," he had said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "And her will reflects that. She has left a number of smaller bequests to various charities and to some of her longtime employees. But the bulk of her estate, the ranch, the land, and all of its holdings she has left to you." I had stared at him, my mind unable to process the words. "To me," I had whispered. "But why? I'm in here. What could I possibly do with a ranch?" "She knew that," he had said, his gaze steady and filled with a meaning I did not yet understand. "She knew exactly what your situation was. And she was very clear in her instructions to me. She said, and I quote, 'Beatrice is the only one who will understand the true value of the land. She is the only one who will know what to do with it.'" He had paused then, letting his words hang in the air before continuing, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "She also told me that she expected her niece, your daughter Vanessa, to show up and cause trouble. She was very specific about her lack of trust in Vanessa's character." He had then explained the details of the estate. It was a multi-million-dollar inheritance, a fortune so vast, so beyond the scope of my own small and now diminished life, that it seemed like a fantasy. He had told me not to worry about a thing, that he and his firm would handle all of the legal and financial details, that his only job was to execute Josephine's wishes and to protect me and my new assets from any and all challenges. He had left me that day in a state of profound, conflicted shock. I was reeling from the grief of my sister's death, and at the same time, I was trying to process the impossible life-altering reality of her final gift. The ranch, the money, it had all seemed like a dream, a strange, beautiful and heartbreaking fairy tale. Now, sitting in my beige box of a room with my daughter and her lawyer pressing in on me, the fairy tale was over, and the grim, ugly reality of my own family's dysfunction had taken its place. Vanessa's words, her cold, pragmatic and cruel assessment of my life, were a brutal, jarring contrast to the memory of Marcus Thorne's quiet, respectful and loyal presence. He was not just my sister's lawyer. He was my champion. He was the first member of my defense, a bulwark I had not even known I possessed. And as I looked at the legal documents my daughter was so impatiently shoving in my face, I knew that I was not alone in this fight. I had the full, formidable legal and financial weight of the estate of the late, great Josephine Devereaux on my side. And I knew with a sudden, satisfying clarity that my daughter, in her arrogant, greedy and beautifully foolish overconfidence, had just made a monumental mistake. The memory of my daughter's last visit, the one that had ended with her effectively abandoning me in this antiseptic box, was a scar on my heart that had never quite healed. It had been 3 years ago after a fall in my own home, a simple, stupid accident that had resulted in a broken hip and a long, painful and frustrating recovery. Vanessa had been a whirlwind of brisk, efficient and utterly emotionless activity. She had managed my hospital stay, she had dealt with the doctors, she had handled the insurance paperwork, all with the cool, detached competence of a professional project manager. I had been so grateful at the time, so moved by what I had mistaken for her love and her concern. I had not seen it for what it was, a logistical problem she was trying to solve as quickly and as permanently as possible. The day she had brought me here to this short-term rehabilitation facility, as she had called it, she had been a vision of bright, cheerful and fraudulent optimism. "It's just for a few weeks, Mom," she had said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright, as she had helped me unpack a small, pathetic bag of my belongings. "Just until you get your strength back. They have the best physical therapists here. You'll be back on your feet and in your own home in no time." It was a lie. I knew it now. I had probably, on some deep, intuitive level, known it then. But I had been too weak, too tired, too broken to fight back. I remembered the day she had left me here. She had settled me into this very room, had fluffed the pillows on the strange, unfamiliar bed, had placed a vase of ridiculously expensive and completely scentless flowers on my bedside table. And then she had looked at her watch, a sleek, modern and very expensive piece of jewelry. "Well," she had said, her voice a wave of brisk finality, "I have to run. I have a showing in an hour. But you'll be fine. The nurses here are wonderful. And I'll call you tonight." She had not called that night. Or the next. The weeks had turned into months, the months into years. Her visits had become less and less frequent, her phone calls shorter and shorter, her excuses more and more elaborate. She was always busy, always stressed, always in the middle of a big, important deal. My life, my health, my loneliness had become a minor, inconvenient footnote in the grand, important story of her existence. The short-term rehabilitation facility had, without any formal discussion, without any acknowledgement of the lie, become my permanent home. And I had, with a slow, grinding and soul-crushing resignation, resigned myself to it. I came to accept that my daughter, my only child, had seen my age, my frailty, my need as a burden, a problem, a logistical inconvenience that she had solved by warehousing me in a clean, safe and soulless institution. Now as she sat before me, her face a mask of impatient, greedy concern, her words a torrent of lies about wanting to manage my burden, the memory of that earlier betrayal, of that first profound act of abandonment, was a hot, bitter acid in the back of my throat. She had not come here to help me. Her purpose was not to protect me. She was here to finish the job, to strip me of the last, final and most valuable piece of my life, my sister's legacy. And she was doing it with the same cool, efficient, and cruel detachment she had displayed when she had left me here to rot 3 years ago. But something was different now. I was different. The woman she had abandoned had been weak, broken, and grieving. The person she was facing now was still grieving, but she was no longer weak. I was a woman who had just been handed a lifeline, a fortune, a reason to fight. And I was also a person who was just beginning to remember the formidable, intelligent, and underestimated woman I had been for a very long time. The spark, the one that would ignite the fire of my own long-overdue rebellion, came from an unexpected and immensely satisfying place. Its source was the memory of my own professional life. The geologist in me was waking up. As Vanessa continued her relentless droning monologue about logistics and paperwork and the burden of the ranch, she made a single fatal and wonderfully ignorant mistake. She scoffed, a short, brittle and dismissive sound. "I mean really," she said, waving a dismissive hand as if to brush away the very idea of the place. "What are we even talking about here? A worthless pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere. The land is probably not even worth the taxes. A worthless pile of rocks." The words, meant as an insult, as a final dismissive nail in the coffin of my sister's legacy, were instead a key. An instrument that unlocked a door in my mind, a portal to a memory that had been dormant for over 20 years. The memory was of my last visit to the ranch, a beautiful sun-drenched week in late summer 2 decades ago. Josephine and I had spent the days on horseback, riding through the vast, wild and breathtakingly beautiful landscape of her property. She had been showing me her latest acquisition, a remote and seemingly barren section of land at the far northern edge of her property. I was not just a tourist. I was a geologist. And as we had ridden, my eyes had not just been seeing the beauty of the landscape. They had been reading it. I had been seeing the narrative of the land, the epic of its formation, the story of the immense, slow and powerful forces that had shaped it over millions of years. And I had seen an anomaly. Something entirely unique, something that had made the hair on the back of my neck stand up with a thrill of pure academic excitement. It was a particular and highly unusual outcropping of pegmatite, a type of igneous rock. And this specific formation was riddled with an equally uncommon mineral, spodumene. I remembered the moment clearly. I had dismounted from my horse, had taken my rock hammer from my saddlebag, and had chipped away a small piece of the rock. It was a pale, almost translucent green, and it had a beautiful, crystalline structure. "What is it, Beatrice?" Josephine had asked, her own eyes alight with a curious, intelligent amusement. "It's lithium, Josie," I had whispered, my voice a reverent, excited thing. "A significant deposit of it. This isn't just a pile of rocks, my dear sister. This is a treasure chest." We had laughed about it then, a shared, secret joke between two sisters who understood the world in very different but equally profound ways. The world at that time had not yet gone crazy for lithium, the mineral that would become the white gold of the 21st century, the essential ingredient in the batteries that would power everything from cell phones to electric cars. It had been a geological curiosity, a scientific marvel, a secret that the land and the two of us had shared. Now, sitting in my beige box of a room, listening to my foolish, ignorant and greedy daughter dismiss my sister's legacy as a worthless pile of rocks, the memory of that day, of that discovery, was not just a memory. It was a weapon. Josephine's words, the ones that Marcus Thorne had repeated to me just a week ago, now echoed in my mind with a new, brilliant clarity. Beatrice is the only one who will understand the true value of the land. She is the only one who will know what to do with it. She had not just bequeathed me a ranch. Josephine had entrusted me with a secret. She had granted me a hidden fortune, a fortune that was not buried in a vault, but was hidden in plain sight, in a language that only I, her sister, the geologist, could understand. And in that moment, the frail, confused and grieving old woman that my daughter saw before her, the woman who was so easily bullied, so easily dismissed, so easily manipulated, vanished. And in her place, a new woman was born. An individual who was the sole and secret heir to a multi-million-dollar lithium deposit. A person who was now armed with a knowledge, a power, and a deep, abiding desire for a very specific and gratifying kind of revenge. The shift inside me was instantaneous and absolute. The fog of grief and confusion was burned away by the clean, white-hot and intensely satisfying fire of a geologist who has just discovered a motherlode. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. I was no longer a frail, old woman. I was the CEO of a very valuable and very secret mining operation. And I knew with a sudden, beautiful clarity, exactly what I had to do. My first priority was to stall. My strategy was to play for time. My immediate goal was to keep my daughter and her pet shark in this room, spinning their wheels until my own real and powerful lawyer arrived. And so I began my performance. I transformed myself with a skill I did not know I possessed, into the very woman they believed me to be. a confused, slightly dotty and overwhelmed old lady. I fumbled for my reading glasses, which were sitting on the bedside table in plain sight. "Oh dear," I said, my voice a quavering, fragile thing. "I can't seem to find my glasses. I can't read a thing without them." Vanessa let out a long, audible and impatient sigh and pointed to the glasses. "They're right there, Mother," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Oh, silly me," I said, my voice a wave of airy, elderly confusion. I put them on, deliberately fumbling with the earpieces. I picked up the legal documents, my hands shaking with a carefully manufactured tremor. My, I said, squinting at the pages. So many words. And the print is so very small." I turned to her lawyer, Davies, my expression a mask of helpless, befuddled confusion. "Young man," I said, "could you be a dear and explain this to me? In simple terms? All this legal jargon just goes right over my head." Davies, who was clearly a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, puffed out his chest and launched into a long, patronizing explanation of the document. He used small words, he spoke slowly as if to a child, and he was so lost in his own performance of brilliant legal condescension that he had no idea he was being played. I would let him speak for a few minutes and then I would interrupt, my voice a quavering, apologetic whisper. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, dear," I'd say, "but what was that word you used? Tortious interference? It sounds so complicated." And he would start all over again, his patience wearing thinner and thinner, his smile becoming more and more strained. Vanessa was practically vibrating with a frustrated, barely contained rage. She was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted, and she was not used to being delayed by the slow and seemingly senile meanderings of her own mother. "Mother, for God's sake," she finally snapped, her mask of filial concern slipping to reveal the ugly, impatient greed beneath. "It's a simple document. It just says you are giving us the ranch. Just sign it." "But I want to understand what I'm signing, dear," I said, my voice a wounded, insincere quaver. "My late husband, your father, always told me to never sign anything I didn't understand." I could see the battle in her eyes, the war between her desire to scream at me and her need to maintain the illusion of the loving, concerned daughter. It was a beautiful, satisfying thing to watch. I recalled from my conversation with Marcus Thorne that he was planning to visit me that afternoon, to go over some of the preliminary paperwork for the estate. I was certain he was due to arrive at 2 o'clock. I looked at the small plastic clock on my bedside table. It was 1:45. I just needed to hold them for another 15 minutes. And so, I deployed my final, most brilliant stalling tactic. I began to reminisce. "You know," I said, my voice a soft, wistful and fraudulent murmur, "this ranch, it reminds me of your great-aunt Josephine. Such a character she was. Did I ever tell you about the time she—" And I launched into a long, rambling, and completely fabricated story about a fictional trip Josephine and I had taken to Mexico in the 1960s. I filled it with pointless details, with long, meandering digressions, with the names of people who had never existed. Vanessa's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated and supremely satisfying agony. She was trapped. She could not be rude to the sentimental and possibly senile old mother who was on the verge of signing over a multi-million-dollar asset. She was forced to sit there, a prisoner in my small beige room, and listen to my endless and utterly meaningless story. The clock on my bedside table ticked over to 1:55. I was in the middle of a particularly pointless and detailed description of a donkey we had allegedly rented, when there was a firm, sharp and authoritative knock on the door. Vanessa and her lawyer both jumped, their nerves clearly frayed to the breaking point. "Come in," I said, my voice a sweet, triumphant coo. And the door opened. And my cavalry, in the form of a tall, impeccably dressed and formidable lawyer, arrived. The entrance of Marcus Thorne into my cramped room was a moment of pure, gratifying theatricality. He was not just a lawyer, he was a presence. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my daughter's car. He carried a heavy, expensive leather briefcase, and he radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable and intimidating power. He walked into the room and the entire emotional atmosphere shifted. The space, which had been a claustrophobic, high-pressure battleground, suddenly became his courtroom. And he was the judge. He nodded politely to me, a small, respectful smile touching his lips. "Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, calm and authoritative rumble. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Marcus, I said, my own voice now shedding its frail, quavering disguise and taking on a new, unfamiliar strength. In fact, you're just in time. My daughter, Vanessa, and her lawyer, Mr. Davies, were just helping me to understand a legal document. Marcus Thorne turned his gaze, which was as cool, as analytical, and as unimpressed as any I have ever seen, first to the slick young lawyer Davies and then to my daughter, Vanessa. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply and with a quiet, dismissive air took their measure. Davies, who was clearly a man who understood the subtle and not-so-subtle hierarchies of the legal world, immediately began to squirm. He recognized on a primal professional level that he was no longer the apex predator in this particular pond. He was a guppy and he had just swum into the path of a very large hungry great white. Mr. Thorne, he stammered, scrambling to his feet, his own expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. What a surprise. I wasn't aware that Mrs. Monroe had retained counsel. I am not Mrs. Monroe's counsel, Marcus Thorne said, his voice a quiet, cutting correction. I am the lead counsel for and the sole executor of the multi-million-dollar estate of the late Josephine Devereaux. And as such I am the legal protector of that estate's primary beneficiary, Mrs. Beatrice Monroe. And who, may I ask, are you? The question, the simple, dismissive, who are you, was a work of art. It was a verbal annihilation, a single elegant sentence that reduced Davies from a professional colleague to a minor, insignificant nuisance. Davies's face, which had been a mask of slick, confident condescension, was now a pale, sweating and panicked mess. Marcus Thorne then turned his cool, analytical gaze to my daughter. Vanessa, who was not as well versed in the subtle, brutal rituals of the legal world, tried to brazen it out. I am her daughter, she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too brittle. And we are just trying to help my mother manage her affairs. She has just inherited a significant and very burdensome asset, and we are trying to ease that burden for her. Marcus Thorne allowed a small, cold, humorless smile to touch his lips. I see, he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. And you are doing this by having her sign a legal instrument, while she is a resident in a state-funded nursing facility, a paper that transfers that multi-million-dollar asset to you for the sum of $1? He glanced at the papers on my bedside table, his eyes missing nothing. And you are attempting this maneuver without her having the benefit of independent legal counsel? Tell me, Mr. Davies, he said, turning his gaze back to the sweating, terrified young lawyer. What is the legal term for that particular course of action? I believe the words felony elder abuse and coercive control come to mind. And I can assure you the district attorney's office takes a dim view of such things, especially when they are perpetrated against the beneficiary of a very large and very high-profile estate. The menace in his words, quiet, professional and tangible, hung in the air like a guillotine that had just been released. The game was over. The trap had been sprung. And my daughter and her pet shark were now officially and irrevocably caught. The retreat was a rout. It was a quiet, gratifying spectacle of a complete and total moral and legal collapse. Vanessa's face, which had been a mask of arrogant, greedy confidence, was now a pale, chalky and unattractive shade of white. Her lawyer, Davies, looked as if he were about to be physically ill. He was a young, ambitious man who had clearly seen this as an easy, lucrative payday. He had not, in his wildest, most hubristic dreams, imagined that he would be walking into a legal buzzsaw, a man who could and clearly would end his entire fledgling career with a single well-placed phone call to the State Bar Association. I think, Davies stammered, his voice a strangled, desperate squeak as he frantically began to gather his papers from my bedside table, that there has been a misunderstanding. We were simply exploring options. We would never, of course, have allowed Mrs. Monroe to sign anything without a full and proper legal review. It was a lie, of course, a pathetic, transparent attempt to rewrite the history of the last hour. But it was the only move he had left. Marcus Thorne just stood there, a silent, unimpressed statue of legal authority, and he let him squirm. My client, your mother, Marcus said, his voice now a quiet, dismissive command directed at Vanessa, is a brilliant and very capable woman. She is also now a very wealthy woman. And she is, as of this moment, under my full and complete legal protection. Any and all future communication with your mother will go through my office. Any attempt to contact her directly to harass her or to intimidate her will be met with the swiftest and most severe legal response imaginable. Do I make myself clear?" Vanessa, who had been rendered completely and beautifully speechless, could only manage a small, jerky, terrified nod. "Good," Marcus said, his voice a final, dismissive full stop. He then turned to me, his entire demeanor softening, the legal warrior replaced by the kind, respectful, loyal friend. "Now, Beatrice," he said, his voice a warm, gentle rumble. "These people are finished. I believe you and I have some very exciting and very profitable business to discuss." And with that, he simply turned his back on them, a gesture of such profound, satisfying dismissal that it was a work of art. He pulled the now vacant visitor's chair up to my bedside, opened his own much more impressive leather briefcase, and began to lay out the preliminary paperwork for the geological survey of my new and very valuable ranch. Vanessa and her lawyer, now completely and utterly vanquished, simply and quietly slithered out of the room, their grand, foolish invasion having ended in a complete, total, and humiliating surrender. The war was over. And I had, without having to raise my voice, without having to sign a single piece of paper, without having to do anything but remember the formidable woman I had always been, won. In the quiet, satisfying aftermath of the rout, a new and unfamiliar energy began to fill my small room. It was the energy of purpose, of possibility, of a future that had, just an hour ago, seemed like a closed and very short book. With Marcus Thorne at my side, I was no longer a patient in a nursing home. I was a CEO, the head of a new and very exciting enterprise. I laid out my theory, my 20-year-old memory of the spodumene deposits, my geologist's hunch that my sister's worthless pile of rocks was in fact a treasure chest. Marcus listened, his expression a mixture of a lawyer's professional skepticism and a deep, abiding respect for the woman his client, my sister, had so clearly and so completely trusted. "If you are right about this, Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, impressed murmur, "then this is not just a multi-million-dollar estate. This is a 10-figure one. This is a legacy that could change the world." He was not a man given to hyperbole. And his words, the quiet, tangible possibility of them, sent a thrill of pure, unadulterated excitement through me, a feeling I had not experienced in years. He immediately went to work. From my small beige room, using his cell phone and his laptop, he began to assemble a team. He made calls to the top geological survey firms in the country, to mining law experts, to commodities brokers. He was a master of his craft, a conductor, bringing together a symphony of expertise and power, all in the service of my and my sister's legacy. The plan was set in motion. A team of geologists would be on the ground at the ranch within a week, their mission to confirm and to quantify the extent of the lithium deposits. The wheels of a massive, profitable new enterprise were beginning to turn. But there was one small and wonderfully satisfying piece of unfinished business to attend to. A week after the disastrous, humiliating meeting in my room, a letter arrived at Marcus Thorne's office. It was from my daughter's lawyer, Davies. It was a pathetic, arrogant attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their failed coup. The letter stated that while his client Vanessa was, of course, delighted for her mother's good fortune, she felt it was only fair and reasonable that the estate of her late and very wealthy Aunt Josephine Devereaux should, at the very least, cover the ongoing and very considerable expenses of her mother's long-term care at the nursing home. Marcus read the letter to me over the phone, his voice a low, amused growl. "The audacity," he said, a note of genuine appreciative wonder in his voice. "It's almost impressive." "Indeed it is," I said, a slow, satisfying smile spreading across my face. "And I have the perfect response." I instructed Marcus to write back to agree wholeheartedly with their request. His reply was a masterpiece of legal and psychological warfare. It stated that, yes, of course, the estate of a wealthy woman like Josephine Devereaux should not be expected to allow her beloved sister to remain in a state-funded facility. And that, yes, of course, the financial responsibility for a parent's care should, legally and morally, fall to their next of kin. And therefore, the letter concluded, on my instruction, he was, as of that day, formally transferring the full and complete financial responsibility for all of my past, present, and future nursing home bills, directly to my only living child and legal next of kin, Vanessa Monroe Scott. The correspondence included a fully itemized and very large bill for the last 3 years of my care, a statement that was now legally and formally her responsibility. It was a beautiful, satisfying checkmate. She had tried to get my sister's estate to pay my bills, and she had ended up with her own greedy and beautifully foolish hands, taking on that debt herself. It was the first and most perfect act of my new gratifying revenge. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a thrilling, satisfying renaissance. The geological surveys came back and they were even better than I had dreamed. The lithium deposit was not just significant. It was one of the largest and purest untapped sources in North America. The news sent a shockwave through the commodities market, and the offers began to pour in. I, Beatrice Monroe, the forgotten 75-year-old woman in a state-funded nursing home, was suddenly one of the most powerful and most sought-after players in the global energy market. The irony was so profound, so beautiful, so immensely satisfying, that it made me laugh out loud. We were, of course, inundated with offers from mining companies, from tech giants, from international investment firms. But I, with the quiet, firm guidance of my own long-dormant geological and ethical principles, chose a different path. I did not sell the mineral rights to the highest bidder. I chose to partner with a new and innovative green energy company, a firm that was committed to sustainable and environmentally responsible mining practices. The resulting partnership was not just profitable but principled. I knew this was an arrangement my sister Josephine would have been proud of. The deal made me a woman of almost unimaginable wealth. But more than that, it gave me a purpose. It gave me a new and very exciting chapter in the story of my life. Meanwhile, my daughter, Vanessa, was having a very different kind of experience. The nursing home bills, which were now legally and irrevocably her responsibility, were a crushing, humiliating debt. She was being hounded by collection agencies. Her credit score was in ruins. Her own fragile, fraudulent lifestyle was collapsing under the weight of her own greedy, beautifully foolish mistake. And so, inevitably, she came crawling back. She appeared not at the nursing home, but at the downtown offices of Marcus Thorne, begging for a meeting, for a handout, for a scrap from the table of the massive, very public fortune I now controlled. I agreed to see her, not in person, but through a formal, satisfyingly legal negotiation. I made her an offer, a final and non-negotiable deal. I would, through an anonymous third-party trust, settle her outstanding debt with the nursing home. I would wipe the slate clean. And in return she would sign a legally binding, permanent document. An agreement in which she relinquished any and all present and future claims to my estate, to my fortune, to my life. A contract stipulating that she would never, ever contact me again. It was a brutal, satisfying choice. She could have her financial freedom, but the price was her mother. She could be free of her debt, but she would, in the process, be free of me forever. She signed the papers. Of course she did. She was her mother's daughter in one small, tragic way. She was a pragmatist. And the pragmatic, soulless choice was to take the money and run. The story ends not in a nursing home, not in a lawyer's office, but in a place of light, of air, of a vast, beautiful and immensely satisfying view. I had, with a small fraction of my new fortune, moved out of the beige box that had been my prison, and into a luxurious, private and beautiful assisted living villa, nestled in the foothills of the very mountains I had spent my life studying. My new home had a wide, sun-drenched patio, a place where I could sit with a cup of tea and a geology journal, and look out at the ancient, silent and wise story of the earth. I was not just a wealthy woman. I was a philanthropist. I had used a significant portion of my fortune to establish a new, very important foundation. The Josephine Devereux Foundation for Women in the Sciences. It was a grant program, a scholarship fund, a mentorship network, dedicated to empowering a new generation of female geologists, chemists, physicists, and engineers. It was a true inheritance, a real legacy, built not on the hollow shifting sands of greed and entitlement, but on the solid, unshakable bedrock of knowledge, of passion, of a sister's love. I had reclaimed not just my wealth but my dignity, my purpose, and my peace. And I had learned, in the most profound and most satisfying way possible, that the greatest fortunes are not the ones that are hidden in the ground, but the ones that are hidden in the quiet, underestimated depths of a woman's mind.